God. And Telos, I want to tell everyone that that we host many organizations in these Sunday events, sometimes individuals, sometimes organizations, often organizations that do similar work to the work that Roots does. But the email I get every week from the Telos group, I literally read cover to cover. And I think that I click on 80% of the links and I read them in depth. I found throughout the years Telos to be the organizations that is most closely aligned with my beliefs, and I think the beliefs are Roots. I learn a lot about the Middle East from these emails that come from Washington, D.C., from the Telos group. I certainly learn a lot about the way the conflict is parsed and understood in the U.S. I learn a lot about peacemaking, about principles of, let's say, spiritual peacemaking. And I actually save a lot of what I learn from Telos and try to put into practice. So that's a nice and a true way of saying how much I admire the work of Telos. Todd is one of two co-founders. I'll introduce him by saying that he spent 16 years in senior positions in the legislature and executive branch of the US government before founding Telos. From 2005 to 2009, Todd was chief of staff in the Secretary of State's Office of Policy Planning at the US State Department. He also spent 2 years as senior advisor in the department's Office of International Religious Freedom, where he specialized in religious freedom in the Middle East. Todd worked for a decade in the US Congress, including 6 years as chief of staff to Senator Tim Hutchinson. He's a graduate of the University of Arkansas and began his career as an educator. He and his family live in Fairfax County, Virginia. So Todd, we offer you the platform to take it away.
Thank you so much, Hanan. That was very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you from the basement of my home in Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. So it's nice to see so many of your faces on the call today. Thank you for showing up. And as Hanan said, just a little bit on the background, I spent most of my life in Republican politics, but on a more personal level, I grew up as an evangelical in the American South, and I still participate in a congregation here in Northern Virginia that would be largely considered evangelical. And I have spent the last 11 years at Telos working largely with evangelical communities throughout America on issues of peacemaking, and in particular in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today a little bit about what we do at Telos. And because evangelicals are such an important sort of force in American politics and culture right now, I know there's been some interest in that. And because it's a community we spend a lot of time with, although we work with other communities as well. But that's sort of the topic we'll take on today. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And let's see if I can make this all work. There we go. And then I need to be able to share.
We have it. We see your screen.
All right. Now I did the wrong thing though. I need to do present. There we go. All right. You can see that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a tutorial then on evangelicalism. But first, a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about Telos. Our mission at Telos is the formation of communities of peacemakers across lines of difference to help heal intractable conflict at home and abroad. And our primary work is helping Americans better understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in ways that support grassroots conflict resolution on the ground, diplomacy, and peacemaking. So it's why we're so interested in having conversations with folks like Hanan and the folks at Roots and the amazing work that they do. And in that work, what we describe ourselves in the American context as being pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace. And either that sounds, that sounds sort of naive, or it sounds incredibly threatening or dangerous or provocative to some. But it's a tagline we intentionally chose to work with Americans. And so I know it would be a difficult stretch for a lot of people who live in the land to embrace that kind of a tagline for themselves personally, or for organizations to do that. But there are some obviously that take a path like that. But our work is to help Americans understand that this conflict is not a zero-sum game. It can't be just one side completely triumphing over the other, that there are two people there with unique and historic connections to the same place, and beautiful cultures in the land, and all of that has to be understood and respected as a means to getting toward some kind of resolution that works for all the people who live there. So that's a little bit of what pro means to us, as we call it: pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. One of our main programs at Telos is a unique travel program where we take Americans to Israel and Palestinian territories, giving them a variety of experiences, introducing them to perspectives from across the spectrum on both societies. And then we also introduce them to a few of the folks who are doing the kinds of things that actually make for peace. We teach them how to embrace the practices of peacemaking in their own lives. And we teach them how to become advocates for the folks on the ground doing the work of peace and coexistence and reconciliation, and also for American policies that are bent toward conflict resolution. We've distilled our learnings over the last 11 years into a document that I will show you now. It's called The Principles of Peacemaking and the Practices of Peacemaking. I can share this with you later if you're interested in seeing it on your own, but I don't want to just sort of read all this to you, but you can see on the left-hand side, the principles of peacemaking are things like growth and the idea that change and transformation are always possible when you don't give up on people or situations. And so you live into a principle of sort of hope, and hope is not the same thing as optimism. We talk a lot about that with our groups. If you're looking at a conflict that's as entrenched and long running as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you're optimistic, you're obviously not paying attention. But there's a different approach, which is to sort of to choose, instead of optimism versus pessimism, to choose hope versus despair. And we believe hope is what you do, and you live and act in hopeful ways in order to open up the possibility of some kind of different thing to occur. So that's an example of one of the principles: equity, which is a little different than equality, but it stems from that. We talk about the importance of peace and justice and how intertwined they are. Martin Luther King famously said, peace is not just the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. We talk about the importance of the work that you do for peacemaking should be done in relationship across lines of difference. So you should root whatever activism you have in the lives of real people who are affected by the conflict. So a lot of Americans care about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but they often don't have their activism truly rooted in the lived reality of people there on both sides, and that's really important. And then we have a real consistency with Roots on a lot of these things, but Roots always talks about its commitment to nonviolence, and we believe that's a central principle of peacemaking as well, and that, as Martin Luther King said, nonviolence is a way of life. We teach people certain practices that you can see on the other side. I'm sorry, I missed the bottom. The last principle is called mutual flourishing. And mutual flourishing really is the underpinning of our slogan, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace. And it's this idea that all the people in the land are, in a sense, neighbors. And I can't have for myself, my family, and my tribe what I want to allow for my neighbor, or what's not available to my neighbor, or what I won't wish for my neighbor in some way. And so that's the sort of the underpinning of what pro actually means, this idea that the flourishing of one is connected to the flourishing of the other. On the practices side, we teach people just to do what's called often active listening, or listening to understand. Not listening to debate or to argue, but listening to understand a point of view that's different from yours. There is an appropriate time for argumentation and debate, but you begin your journey always by trying to listen to understand. You also sometimes have to hold competing truths in tension, and there's no greater example of that than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have many Israeli narratives, many Palestinian narratives, and you have to in some way hold them in tension with each other because they don't reconcile. There's a shared history in the land, and yet the different tellings of it and the different experiences of it sound very different. And so you have to be willing to hold different truths in tension. And we draw on the work of a physicist named Niels Bohr, who said that the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. And so it's sometimes embracing the complexity of different tension, the different truths that you can find an even greater truth. We also teach people to own their own agency and responsibility for the things that they know and care about. We teach them to center the leadership of the marginalized, which again is very connected to being in relationship with people. So allowing the folks who are caught up in the midst of difficult circumstances and living in vulnerable conditions to really help lead what activism you engage in. We teach people that one of the most important rules you can do in peacemaking, well before casting blame or judgment on the other side, is to engage in a process of self-interrogation of yourself and your community. I have very little ability to change what you think about anything. I can barely change myself, but my best option for change actually comes from within myself and within my own.
Could you slow down?
I sure can. Yes, I'm sorry for going so fast. And again, I can also share a copy of this with others.
Yeah, that would be great if you share a copy of these principles.
Yes, absolutely. And then the final thing is it's again comes from Martin Luther King, the idea of what your aim is. The word telos in Greek means your purpose or your aim, the big thing that you're shooting for. And for King, it was always about the beloved community. And so King made very clear that his ambition was not to defeat white people in the American South. It was to defeat the unjust system that plagued everyone, but uniquely plagued Black Americans. And the idea was that he wanted to actually make his opponents ultimately partners and maybe even friends, because the idea was that you would create a beloved community where everyone would live in justice and equity and in relationship with each other, which is very much connected to the concept of mutual flourishing as well. So that's just a little, very quick insight into some of the things that guide what we do and guide our programming and the things that we do in both in our trips and in the other programming we do with our community in the United States. So more quickly, or more appropriately though, to the sort of topic that I think that you came to hear about today, and that is the role of evangelicals in American politics and the way in which many evangelicals have such affection for Israel. And so what I will spend a little time doing that is to talk about that from my own experience. And what I want to say is that I'm not a social scientist or an academic. So I'm not going to wow you with statistics and polling data. I'm at best an amateur historian, but I have experience coming from this community and working with this community. And that's what I'm going to speak from today. And so before I jump into all of that with a little bit of my own understanding, I wanted to give some particular time for Q&A. If you had any questions about telos or anything I've already said before we jump into the topic of evangelicals.
Sir?
Yes.
Can you explain as best you can exactly what an evangelical is?
Yes, that's going to be, I think, the next slide. So that's where I'm headed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get to this too. Would you say that telos seeks to work primarily with evangelicals? Are you targeted toward other Christians as well, or is evangelicals really your focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't necessarily start out to primarily work with evangelicals. We have always aimed to work with a variety of communities, but we have found some real opportunities within the evangelical world. And we have probably, I'd say 60 to 70% of our work right now is with evangelicals. We also work with some other sectors as well: entrepreneurs, business leaders, academics, artists, musicians, storytellers, that sort of thing. But we have just sort of had an opportunity there, and we've taken advantage of that and spent about 2/3 of our time with evangelical communities.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
What is the racial, religious, and ethnic makeup of your organization? Like, who's in your organization?
Yes. So we have, there are two of us who founded Telos 11 years ago, Greg Khalil and myself. So Greg is a Palestinian American attorney from California. And so we came together across our own lines of difference to form Telos. Greg is from a very progressive background from California. His father was a Palestinian Christian from Bethlehem who emigrated to the United States before Greg was born. He comes from a family of academics. I come from the opposite background in almost every way. So those are the two of us who lead the organization. And we are the
So you two were the founders of the organization, you and Greg.
That's right.
Okay.
That's correct. Yes. So we have 2 to 3 staff in Israel. Normally we've had 3 until just now. So we in an office in Tel Aviv. So and one of those is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and the other 2 are Jewish citizens of Israel, and they are supporting our trip programming and leading our trip programming. And then we have a small office in the United States, and I wouldn't even be able to describe everyone's background. 2 of them are Christian, and we have another person who works for us in New York City, where Greg lives, who's also Christian. So we've also begun to work in doing some work outside of Israel and the Palestinian territories, in that we've developed a program in the United States that's through the American South, which is an attempt to tell a more complete American story, particularly through a lens of race. And so we've launched that program about 2 years ago. And we also have a partner organization that we work with to do some of the staffing for that, the leadership of that as well, from the African-American community. Any other questions?
What is the partner organization?
It's called Arabon. It's a reconciliation program based in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right. So I'll do another Q&A at the end, and we can talk any more about Telos that you want. But I'll jump into our topic of evangelicals. So the question that Gilda had, I think, was what is an evangelical? There's no clear definition, and that's one of the problems. But I think, for those of you on the call who are Jewish, if I ask you to define what it means to be Jewish, we could probably have some interesting conversation about what does it mean to be Jewish. There's something similar about the term evangelical. People use it differently to mean different things. And there's probably as much disagreement as consensus about how we define what an evangelical is. But I would say in the main, it looks something like this, and there are exceptions to almost everything that I'm saying here, but this is just a sort of a normative main center kind of view. It is a Protestant Christian, even though there's some Catholics who have what is described as an evangelical faith, but it's almost exclusively Protestant, with a high regard for the authority of the Bible as the revealed word of God, a belief that Jesus is the Messiah and the Savior of the world, a belief that a personal relationship with God is possible, and some kind of command or obligation to share this news, this good news, or the word is gospel, with others. And so I think that's probably a definition that would capture most evangelicals in one way or the other. Now we'll go sort of through the history of evangelicalism, and you'll see some other features that will be really important to some and not to others, but that's a sort of working definition for us now. Anybody have questions about that?
Yeah, I have a question just with the your second bullet point, and I'm just to tell you, I'm from Germany, and I come myself from a German evangelical background, so
Yes.
I know these principles very well, and that's why I'm taking part in this conference, because to me in the past, and I was very, very surprised when the announcement was pro-Israeli, pro-peace, pro-Palestinian, because as the evangelicals come over, also now in the election campaign in America and everywhere, they are great friends. I have to tell you, I'm the leader in Germany of an interfaith dialogue organization between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And I have developed into this from my own evangelical background, but I've been very critical to my evangelical background because it has always been the the mission of the evangelicals, on the one side, to be solidaric with Israel, but in the same time to missionize Jews and Judaism in order to make the Jews believe that Jesus is their own Messiah and Savior of the world. And therefore, it has always been, to me, a contradiction that on the one side, the evangelicals are so much pro-Israel, but in the same time, they don't accept Judaism as a unique way to God and still believe that Jews need to be missionized towards Jesus. And so I wanted to put that question at the end, but now I see it's in the very beginning, your second bullet point. All the other ones, the first, the third, and the fourth is okay, but the second is exactly the crucial point. How can evangelicals be so pro-Israel and in the same time they're not anti-Jewish, but they believe that Christianity is a superior revelation and that Judaism is not a direct and unique way to heaven or to God.
Yes, and 2 and 4 are obviously the source of centuries of oppression and conflict between Jews and Christians, and are really at the root of the birth of and perpetuation of anti-Semitism and so forth. So there's a whole thing there that does
exactly
to the sort of pro-Israel experience today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about at least the modern conceptions of support for Israel within the evangelical community. So that's a great marker. Thank you. So let me just kind of explain a little bit more, expand on some of this. Evangelicals may or may not be part of a Christian denomination. So you can be an evangelical in a Protestant denomination like Lutheranism or Protestant or Presbyterianism, Episcopalian, and so forth. And it can just be kind of a standalone, non-denominational, as it's known, church. And many evangelical churches in America they're not affiliated with any denomination, and they have no hierarchy, and there's no supervisory authority over them. They literally are standalone communities that only are responsive to themselves and whoever the leader may be, which also leads to all sorts of activism in different directions that may be just peculiar to a particular leader or individual or community of people without any kind of accountability above that in terms of religious hierarchy of any kind. It's a global movement, and evangelicalism is particularly strong in sub-Saharan Africa today and in Latin America and in parts of Asia. And both globally and in the US, there are many evangelicals who are Black and brown, and that's really an important point. We're in some ways not talking about that as much today. We're focusing more on evangelicalism in the United States, and we're going to focus a little bit more on white evangelicalism in the United States, because white evangelicals are the ones that are very connected to political power right now, and also particularly very involved in some of the advocacy around issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we're going to focus a little bit more on that. But I do want us to understand that it's a much larger movement than just Americans and white Americans at that. But that's where we're going to spend a little bit of most of our time.
Do you have space for one more question, or do you want to go ahead?
No, you can. That's fine.
Okay. Would you add anti-abortion to this list? And I'm asking from also my own direct personal experience. I'm Jewish. I live in North Carolina. I talk to evangelicals every day, and
we're going to get there. I'm headed that direction. Yes, that's incredibly significant, and I will address that just in a bit.
Thank you.
So the modern evangelical world grew out of revivalist movements, particularly in the US and Britain. In America, we had these things called the Great Awakenings, one in the 18th century, one in the 19th century, that in many ways laid a religious and spiritual foundation for the country and are the antecedents of modern evangelicalism. Charles Darwin plays an important role in the evolution of evangelicalism, pun I guess intended in that or whatever. But later on, the 1967 war plays an important role in shaping what evangelicalism is, and I'm going to explain both those things. But first, let's start with Darwinism. In the 19th century, as many Protestants attempted to reconcile Christian faith with the scientific revolution and with Darwinism, there was a reaction of those who wanted to return to the fundamentals of the faith and doubled down on more literal interpretations of the Bible in particular. And then in the 1940s and 1950s, these fundamentalists split between those who wanted to more fully engage the world and of culture and politics and so forth, and those who continued to argue for separation and cultural resistance. And the group that was more willing to engage in the public square became the larger group and really became the precursors of today's evangelicals, right? So there's still a fundamentalist movement that exists in America today that's more separated, that would kind of largely agree with the things that are on the screen in front of you. But when we talk about evangelicals, we're mostly talking about those who kind of became dominant and broke away and moved toward cultural re-engagement after a period of kind of isolation, especially in the early 20th century. And among the leaders of this movement was a very famous evangelist that we probably all heard of named Billy Graham. If you haven't heard another evangelical leader in history, you've probably heard of Billy Graham. The cultural shifts of the 1960s and the 1970s began to send these folks, evangelicals, more directly toward the political arena in particular. Among the drivers were a number of US Supreme Court decisions, including a 1963 ban on prayer in public schools, and the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision legalizing abortion that was just referred to. It's also fair to say, it would be unfair not to say that while the civil rights movement and other protest movements, and in particular the urban unrest that accompanied them, along with the sexual revolution, began to draw evangelicals to political action. So not evangelicals were motivated to sort of oppose the civil rights movement, but there were some, particularly in the South, who also became politically active around issues of integration. And so that's an important thing to note. And I don't want to I don't want to use too broad a brush to paint this community in such harsh light, because it's definitely not entirely true, but it is particularly true in certain places, and that's important to say. But not all evangelicals were on the same side of these cultural issues, even in the 60s and 70s. And if you remember, Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976 as a born-again Baptist evangelical and a very moderate Democrat, and many evangelicals voted for him. But by the late 1970s, the dominant form of evangelical political activism was aligning with the ascendant conservative movement and Republican politics. Evangelical voters were first organized into a conservative voting bloc by this guy that you see in the photo, Jerry Falwell, and the leaders of what he called the moral majority. Jerry Falwell, who I'm sure you've heard of, was the founder of Liberty University here in Southwest Virginia. And their support for Reagan in the 1980 election made them a key part of all future Republican coalitions. And so evangelicals really become kind of they're a unique voting bloc within the Republican coalition, particularly following the 1980 election. These, I went the wrong direction, sorry. Did I go in the wrong place? Oh yeah, so these religious right evangelicals brought with them into the Republican Party a number of concerns and positions that have reshaped and redefined the Republican Party today. So this gets to the point, I didn't get your name, the woman from North Carolina, but
Roberta.
Roberta, but this gets to your point. So with them, when they come into the Republican politics, they bring with them a pro-life position on abortion, and not a, the Catholics have an understanding of a pro-life position that is sort of an all-of-life pro-life position, a holistic pro-life position. This is actually more of an anti-abortion position than an authentic pro-life position. That's more of an editorial comment that you probably wanted from me. But a pro-life position on abortion and conservative positions on other social issues. That becomes part of what evangelicals bring to the party. And if you think about the Republican Party in the 1970s, before the evangelicals were participating in this way, the President Ford's wife, Betty Ford, was a strong defender of the Roe v. Wade decision and of the Equal Rights Amendment. There was a lot of diversity within the party on social issues before in the 1970s. A second feature that evangelicals brought to the party was support for strong defense and projections of American power in the world. And this was caught up in the time of the Cold War in particular, with the Soviet Union. And there was a real sense, Reagan's language of the Soviet Union being the evil empire was very appealing to the evangelical understanding of the dynamics of what were going on there, and they were very strong defenders of the American military, and still to this day. Thirdly, a real understanding of America as a divine project, American exceptionalism, as we call it, a belief that America is uniquely blessed by God and an instrument of God's providence, which extends, and you hear you hear in a subset of evangelicalism today, particularly in the most ardently pro-Israel part of that world, you hear a lot of talk about there are only two covenanted nations in all of human history, and Israel, both ancient and modern, and the United States are the two coveted nations in all of human history. And so this American exceptionalism really gets into the Republican Party with the evangelicals' arrival. Fourth, strong commitment to American patriotism and nationalism. And I would personally say American evangelicalism, in some ways, it can be more American than Christian at times. And I say that as a Christian who has a reaction against that kind of thing. But you often see flags in churches as a very dominant thing, and patriotic celebrations inside worship, sanctuaries and so forth, on national holidays and so forth. And then fifthly, a support for Israel and a belief that God's blessing in the United States was directly tied to our relationship with Israel. And that again is a very significant thing that evangelicals bring into Republican politics that didn't exist in the same way before that. And I will use a quote from the current Vice President of the United States, at least for a couple more months, Mike Pence, when he was a Republican congressman from the state of Indiana, who he said, my support for Israel stems largely from my personal faith. In the Bible, God promises Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. And for our purposes, what's most important is the fact that the fusion of the religious right with the Republican politics has resulted in a party litmus test on Israel. It's still important for Democrats to be pro-Israel in America, but they can define that broadly enough to have differing views on issues, even like annexation that was recently debated. Republicans can no longer dissent in the same way, and that's largely because of what a subset of evangelicalism has brought into the party. This understanding of Israel, though, as I want you to know, is not a new thing. It's just now come to power in the Trump presidency in its most direct way. But its origins are in the 1800s, when a British clergyman named Darby developed an end times theology that's called dispensationalism. Has anyone heard of that before?
Yes. It was very strong, and it started even in Germany, and it went through England to the 1834. The end of the world and the coming of Christ. That was part of Darwinism, and also this Christian Zionism in Europe.
Yeah, and so for about 1800 years of Christianity, this was not the way Christians read the book. The book, it's in the Hebrew Bible, of Ezekiel and Daniel, and the New Testament books of the Gospels and the book of Revelation. It's a modern phenomenon going back to the early 19th century. But this was a prediction that the return of the Jewish people to Palestine would happen, and that would be the precursor for the second coming of Jesus.
Yes.
And it's a very important part of this story. And before Herzl, Darby's brand of Christian Zionism was having influence in Europe. And so by the time, through Lord Shaftesbury and others in England, it was also influential later on Lord Balfour in 1917. And I saw someone there from Jerusalem, and some of you from other places in the land. If you go to the Friends of Zion Museum, I don't know if you've been there or not in Jerusalem, there is, this new museum in the heart of Jerusalem. And this tells the story of Christian Zionism as it predates the modern Zionism of Herzl. Dispensationalism exported to the United States and became it sort of dies away to some extent in Britain eventually, but it becomes part of the fundamentalist movement in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But it didn't fully capture the popular imagination until 1967. So as I said earlier, one of the events that helped shape modern evangelicalism was the 67 war. Israel's victory in the Six-Day War was widely seen as a miraculous and divinely orchestrated event. And it kind of broke this this sort of marginalized eschatology or end times theology out of seminaries and sort of pockets of fundamentalism into a wider culture. And one of the most popular books of the 1970s was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, you see on the left of your screen there, which attempted to interpret current events through the lens of biblical prophetic writings, and which predicted war in the Middle East and the end of the world, and very soon, by a guy named Hal Lindsey, who is still alive, and I think he actually lives in Israel. He was a Christian from California who wrote this book and sold, millions of copies in the 1970s. And then that sort of helps to popularize this kind of eschatology or end times theology with lots of people in ways that the very wonky, theology that had been presented in seminaries had not captured people's imagination. That was followed by a series of novels called the Left Behind series in the 1990s and 2000s, and a really bad Nicolas Cage movie. And I mean, that's on the level of, there are a lot of really bad Nicolas Cage movies, but this may be the worst. And in this series, the Left Behind series, the modern state of Israel is the star of these wildly popular novels that sold tens of millions of copies. So as politics, in our view, is largely downstream from culture in America, the political views generated by evangelicals began to make their way to Washington. And in many ways, as I said earlier, they've remade the Republican Party. So in the 2016 election, Jeb Bush, whose father was incredibly close to Jim Baker, not just the fact they had served together, worked together, and Baker had, been the elder Bush's Secretary of State and campaign manager in 1992 and so forth, but they were personal friends. And when Jim Baker gave a talk that was critical of the Israeli Prime Minister, Jeb Bush disassociated with him and said he's not a part of my campaign and so forth. And that's to the extent that, in a Republican primary, it was not possible to be associated with Jim Baker because of what he was perceived to be anti-Israel. And so by the year 2020, evangelicalism is in the United States still includes a lot of the classical definition that I gave earlier, but a lot of it also becomes indistinguishable it's a segment of evangelicalism becomes indistinguishable from the politics and the political program of President Trump. And so this is a quote from Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, who we talked about earlier, who in his own right, as an evangelical leader, the founder of a humanitarian ministry called Samaritan's Purse. And Franklin Graham said, 70 years ago today, the state of Israel was established. This was obviously, you can define when this was happening, in 2018. In fulfillment of prophecy, God brought the nation into being, and he's sustaining them for the day when the Lord Jesus Christ himself will return and establish his throne in Jerusalem, as scripture tells us. And so today, many evangelicals who don't support Trump and the Trump program have literally ceased calling themselves evangelicals. So it's forced a real identity crisis within evangelicalism because evangelicalism has become very synonymous with a lot of the policies of the Trump administration, and particularly on the view of Israel. And so today, a lot of evangelicals care about Israel, and the lens they see it through is sort of one of these. I would say there are many who have this end times theology, although dispensationalism as a theology is still not credible. In fact, it's less credible today than it was 50 years ago. But there are some that still have an end times prophecy view that the world is about to end, and that there's going to be violent war in the Middle East soon, and that even there's no reason to try to prevent it because it is all a part of God's unfolding plan. But for others, there's more of this view, and I'm being a little pejorative here, but seeing Israel as sort of a lucky rabbit's foot through the United States. And this goes back to that quote I gave you earlier that just said, Mike Pence said, what does
it mean? I speak lucky rabbit. What does that mean?
Well, it's a good luck charm, maybe is another way to say it.
Okay.
It's basically it's taking the verse from Genesis where God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you, and it's applying that to the modern state of Israel and America's relationship to it. And so I think way more than those who have an end times theology of, the most of American evangelicals and their attitude toward Israel, if they have a pro-Israel attitude, and most do, would be more along the lines of, it's just our obligation to bless Israel as Americans, because if we don't do that, God will curse us, and it will lead to the destruction of America. And then for others, neither of these things are the dominant thing, but there's just an affinity of values. Israel is a democracy. We come from the same family root, the Judeo-Christian heritage, and also for many, there is a real sense of anti-Islam within the evangelical world, and so there's this clash of civilizations in which what is happening in the Middle East is it's Jews versus Muslims, and and if we're not fighting them there, we're going to be fighting them here, and that sort of thing. So all of those things are ways that evangelicals see Israel today. And I think those are helpful to at least get there's some diversity with what's driving folks. Some people think it's all about the end times theology. That's actually less significant, I think, than the other two. But famously in the 2016 election, I was going to give, I can do this. If you want, I'll do this. This was back when President Trump made an announcement that he was going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And Johnny Moore is a young evangelical leader. He was the chaplain at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University at one point. And he's now the convener of President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Committee. And NPR in the U.S. asked Johnny Moore in an interview about the decision to move the embassy. And Johnny said, "This decision will be met by political praise and by theological conviction, and evangelicals in every corner of the U.S. will be ecstatic." And the reporter said, evangelicals feel a special kinship with Jerusalem as the city where Christ was crucified and rose again. Moore says for his advisory group, the only issue more important than Jerusalem has been who gets appointed as federal judges, which gets back to the comment about the significance of abortion. And then Johnny said, in our various meetings with the White House, the listening sessions, this issue has always come up. And not only has it always come up, but it's always been an extended discussion around the table. And I mean, at the heart of the relationship between the United States and Israel is the friendship between evangelical Christians and the Jewish people. And so obviously, we've seen a lot of photos like this, but this is the Evangelical Advisory Committee with praying with the president. And so in this 2016 election, 81% of self-identified evangelicals voted for Trump, and they remain his most dedicated constituency. That number did drop a bit in 2020, and the number, as you know, votes are still being counted and certified. But some estimates say that Trump is down as much as 5%, which is still a very healthy 76%. But the difference is being touted by some as even critical to Biden's victory. For instance, in Georgia, a state with a large number of evangelical voters, Hillary Clinton got 5% of white evangelicals, and Joe Biden got 14%, and he only won by 14,000 votes in the state. So there is some slippage in the president's support amongst evangelicals, and that accrued to the benefit of Joe Biden. In the state of Michigan, the numbers are even starker. There were as many as 290,000 additional white evangelical voters for Biden than voted for Hillary Clinton, and that was also a close state. But what you've had for the last 4 years is a group of evangelical leaders with unprecedented access to the president and his administration, and they've made clear publicly and privately that the two issues they care the most about are the federal judiciary and America's relationship to the state of Israel, as Johnny Moore said. So just to end with a few numbers and maybe a couple of maps. Depending on how you define it, and how you ask the question, the number of evangelicals in America ranges somewhere between 10 and 35%. And so it is hard because, again, not everybody wants to identify as an evangelical. Pollsters often ask different kinds of questions. Sometimes they use the language of, are you a born again Christian, which captures a lot more folks that are not white. White people tend to use the evangelical label more than people of color. Black and brown evangelicals tend to talk about a born again experience, but they don't really use the term evangelical because it has become so associated as with all the things we've just talked about. But it's somewhere between 10 and 35%. The highest numbers, as I said, involve Black and brown Christians. For our purposes, with the focus on white evangelicals, it's probably 10 to 20% of the population and around a quarter of the Republican Party. They definitely skew the numbers of how Republicans see Israel and Palestinians. The work of Shibli Telhami, a professor at the University of Maryland, is really good at parsing out how evangelical Republican voters have very strong views about things. So in fact, non-evangelical Republicans have views that are more similar to Democrats and independents on issues like Israel and the Palestinians and Islam than they do to other Republicans who are evangelical. Here's the point. Evangelicals have been a key part of the American story from the beginning, and they're not going away. The non-evangelical Protestants, mostly represented by what we call mainline Protestants, are losing members even as evangelical versions of those denominations are often growing. And as the nuns in America are growing, those who profess no religious identity at all, the number of evangelicals is actually holding pretty steady. So these people aren't going away. So if you care about American foreign policy and domestic policy, and these are folks worth engaging, and there's a history of engaging them in helpful ways. I'll show you a couple maps, and then I'll end with a couple of ideas about how we try to engage evangelicals. This is a map that I don't think I have the key on there. I'm sorry about that, but it's the darker the color it means the higher percentage of those who self-identify as evangelical Christians. So you can see, particularly in the American South, is the concentration of evangelicals, and to some extent in the West, but particularly in the American South. And then if you look at the map of the 2016 election map, you can see some similarity to where President Trump was strongest. And that's the 2020 map. I did have the 2016 map, and I put the new one in just yesterday. So this is the 2020 map, but you do see some similarity between those two maps, between where evangelicals are in clear majorities and the support for President Trump. All right, so how do you engage and try to reach evangelicals? Our methods are to basically humanize the conflict and the people there, and to make them care. And so to really put the human face on it, to introduce them to real Israelis and real Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, and let them understand their stories. I believe, and I think Telos believes, we've been shaped by the moral psychology of a professor named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a really brilliant book called The Righteous Mind. If you haven't read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, I check it. You have it there? Yes, you've got it. So Jonathan Haidt said, is one of those moral psychologists who says that we imagine that we're very rational beings, but we are in fact very much more emotive and intuitive beings who create rationales to explain why we feel certain things. And so, and it's true that we rarely can argue someone into a new position on something. I mean, I've rarely had someone just give me the facts and I've changed my mind because my facts weren't adequate. But I have changed my mind on things, but it's often because I've had a human connection to something, or I've had an experience with something. And so it's the humanization of things that actually opens us up to creating new sets of facts, or availing ourselves of different facts that will explain why we now think something different. We also try to show evangelicals their own complicity in this, because if you say you care about Israel and Israelis, is your engagement there and the things that you're supporting, are they actually helping, or are they making things worse? Are you being a part of the solution? Are you helping those trying to work for coexistence and peace between the communities and so forth? Or are you just one more party who signed up to the conflict in an us versus them kind of dynamic? And so just showing them that is an important part of this too. A third thing, demonstrating that they don't have to flip from being pro-Israel to being anti-Israel. If I take someone on a trip and they start out as being pro-Israel, and by the end of it all they're anti-Israel, I've entirely failed. It's not about changing teams, flipping sides. Again, it's breaking out of the binary of one versus the other, and stepping into broadening the aperture and stepping into a larger space that says, if I really want to be pro-Israel, I also have to in some way be pro-Palestinian. And for those who come on my trips who begin the journey pro-Palestinian, if I really want to be pro-Palestinian, I also have to be pro-Israeli. There's no good future for one people in the land without a good future for the other. And then we help them draw on the best of their faith tradition to overcome the worst of it. And so these theologies and eschatologies that really dehumanize people, and that preference war and violence over peace and reconciliation and God's shalom, are they're there, but we try to help people dig deeper into the things that Jesus taught. For instance, about Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Jesus said, "Love your enemies." Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." There's a number of teachings that are very simple, but then there's some deep theologies of the kingdom of God that we can also introduce people to, that help them find new ways to live out their faith. And one of the things that it's important for Christians to always remember is that Jesus said that all of the law can be summed up in two ways: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And whatever your theology is, if it's not working itself out in a way that is demonstrating both the love of God and the love of other human beings, then something is fatally flawed in it, and it ought to be reconsidered. And so, a lot of our work is to help these leaders and communities dig deeper into the theology of peacemaking and other things, to find ways to, again, broaden their own way of engaging places like Israel, Palestine. And with that, I will stop the flood of information and be happy just to have whatever conversation or take whatever questions that you'd like. Unshare my
Where
screen.
in the evangelical philosophy or theology came the idea that Trump was the Messiah or the second Cyrus? How did that play into all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing the screen. Hanan, can you intervene and unshare so that we can see everybody more fully? There we go. Thank you. Okay. That taps into another strain with evangelicalism that's important to talk about, another theological strain, which is there's a passage in the New Testament book of Romans, the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, about the giving proper respect for authority, because all authority is God ordained, is the way it's talked about. And so this passage is often used to justify obedience to political leadership, no matter who they are. There's a selectivity about it, however, because the same people who have been entirely forceful about demanding that all Christians have to support President Trump as God-ordained leadership didn't say those things about President Obama. And they strangely aren't saying those things now, even though by all, purposes, it seems that, it's not seems, but Joe Biden has actually won the most recent election. And so there's a selectivity that happens in that. But it feeds into an evangelical sort of problem over at least the last 30, 40 years, as evangelicals have engaged in politics, and they have conflated their own political ambitions. They've sort of baptized them, and then any leader who is actually being willing to carry those out gets this extra mantra of sort of providential, leadership laid on them. And it really is the Israel piece that has led many of them to describe Trump in various terms, but as a modern day Cyrus, a modern day Esther. The American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, likened him to Esther. But it's not unique to Christians either. I mean, I think Miriam Adelson also called Trump a modern day Cyrus too. So it's not just evangelicals who have tried to sort of take that, that view.
Todd, there are some questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to read them?
Why don't you call on the folks who asked them and let them just, if you don't mind, just let them ask themselves.
Good idea. So, Ricky, would you like to speak up and bring up the question that you wrote about? Ricky?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, what did I ask here? Let's see if I can
Reverend,
find
I have another question later.
Okay, so Ricky, what you wrote is,
okay.
Can you see what you wrote?
Yes,
Ricky?
why do you hang on to the evangelical title when clearly it has lost its original meaning and taken on a rather negative response? And also your original definition of evangelical, as I understand it, would describe actually the most basic Christian beliefs, whether Catholic, Protestant, etc. Who Jesus is and all of that. So that's my question.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are great questions. Well, first of all, it's a good question, and it's hard for me to say that I am actually hanging on to there are many evangelicals who believe it is something worth redeeming and not just allowing to be completely taken over. And so they think there's a reason to sort of stay in the fight. Evangelicals have contributed a lot of positive things to American life. I didn't talk about that, but it was evangelicals who were very involved in, particularly in the 19th century, and a lot of the reform movements. Most of white abolitionism in the 19th century arose out of evangelical faith. A lot of the progressive movement of the 20th century, a lot of the progressive reforms that occurred in the 20th century was connected to Christian faith and even evangelicalism. So the history of reform and evangelicalism being tied together. And so I think that there are many folks who don't want to let that go. Even in the early 2000s, evangelicals were very involved in the program that was created in the Bush years to fund AIDS, the global HIV/AIDS pandemic and epidemic, and the malaria fund that was created to send hundreds of millions of dollars to particularly sub-Saharan Africa for healthcare purposes. And there's a rich heritage that some are not willing to give up on. The reality is that a younger generation, though, is walking away from this as quickly as you can imagine. I mean, if this trend continues that we see right now, my kids who are in their 20s will not be identifying in this way at all. And my wife is on staff at a church, and she completely rejects the label and vocally says, I am no longer an evangelical. I have nothing to do with that. So it is being abandoned pretty quickly.
And I can appreciate that history very much. And I can appreciate that was not a term that used to be offensive, but things change very quickly nowadays. So I agree with you that young people, are much faster to discard it than us elders who hang on to what things used to mean. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Very informative.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ricky. And your second question about doesn't that just sort of like every Christian? I'd say the distinction of evangelicals more than other mainline Christians, mainline Protestant Christians, would be the real emphasis on the literal nature of the Bible. I mean, but evangelicals tend to read the Bible more literally. And some of that is in the fundamentalist camp, but most evangelicals have a much higher regard for what the Bible says in a more literal sense, and a greater sense of compulsion to share their faith than maybe non-evangelical Christians, because they have more of an emphasis on a very personalized faith as well. And so again, that's
okay.
So Todd, there's a question from my colleague here in Shorashim in Roots, Myron Joshua. Myron, do you want to say your question?
Okay, no problem. I wanted to know if one of the possible influences, potential influences on Christian evangelical Zionists, I put that in quotation marks, could be Jewish thinkers and theologians whose views are a little bit more complex, let's say, and even though too many of the Jewish thinkers perhaps think it's pragmatic not to open up and to try to influence Christian and evangelicals to make their theology more subtle, but could Jewish thinkers help influence the evangelicals?
I think that's a great question, a great observation. And I mean, I can't say with certainty, but I don't have any experience with, there's a lot of connection now between particularly Orthodox Judaism and evangelicalism that never existed in history, right? And there's a lot of kind of common cause that's been made in the last 20, 30 years, and a lot of interaction, but I don't know of a lot of it that's being done at the level of theology, especially like theology of the land and covenant and Zion, around Zionism. And I think it could be enormously helpful if there were, because I think that, I mean, my own experience in just, knowing and sitting with rabbis and having long conversations about some of these issues is that the level of complexity and nuance and sort of thought and attention that have been given to these issues the rabbinical tradition is like way more than Christian Zionists have ever imagined. So they have a kind of well thought out dispensationalist eschatology that's quite elaborate, but they have not argued with the text in the same way, and they have not argued with it certainly in the same way that religious Jews have. And I think they would benefit from understanding that. And I don't know what impact it might have on their own thinking, but it would be worth engaging them around some of those issues, I think.
Thank you, Todd. There's a question from Carol. Carol, would you like to open the microphone and say your question?
My question had to do with the evangelical. Let me just say, I believe there's one God and God loves all his people. And so it troubles me when you have one group trying to impose their view on other groups through sharing the good word or proselytizing. And my question had to do specifically with the evangelical view on immigration, because so many of the people coming from Latin America are Christian. Why not accept them? Why try and stop immigration to the United States? It didn't make sense to me if you're embracing Christians.
No, it's a great question, Carol. Thank you. I mean, and I agree with everything you've said, to be honest, to be frank. But I would say I have a good friend who lives in El Paso, Texas, and runs a whole Christian ministry helping those who are seeking asylum and trying to immigrate, and those who and there are so many Christians who are involved in the work of immigration and refugees and so forth. It's not the dominant story, because evangelical voters have voted and been voted and vocally voted and spoken out against immigration. And it is the way in which, one of the things I said in there is a way in which American evangelicalism is often more American than evangelical. And so there's also a way in which white American evangelicalism is more white than Christian in some ways too. And so there's some real reckoning that's happening within the evangelical world. And there's a former current Southern Baptist named Robert Jones, who's written a new book on evangelicalism and its white supremacy problem. But what you're seeing there is the conflation of that issue of the white supremacy more than the obligation to treat the immigrant and the stranger, and which are in your scriptures. I mean, right? And we learned that from the Hebrew scriptures, and they're not being seen in those terms. And it is ironic that most of the folks that are trying to seek asylum in the United States from our southern border are Christians, and they're the folks who are most vocal in denying them entry into the country are other Christians, and that's its own commentary that is tragic.
Thank you for that, Todd. The next question is from Eva. Eva, would you like to speak?
Sure, it's Eva. So you said right up front that evangelical theology has this good news aspect and that and a proselytizing aspect. And given that, I wonder why it is that Jews and Muslims should trust anything that you have to say or do, since it doesn't seem like you have our best interests at heart. I get it that y'all are powerful, but other than sort of dealing with that reality, why should we trust you?
You have no reason to, Eva. I totally agree with you. I mean, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, but thank you for saying it. I wish that I had recorded you saying that, and I would love to share that with many others in the evangelical world to understand that the evangelical brand is perhaps permanently tarnished, even globally right now.
Okay, that was a unique answer. Jenny Nemko would like to ask a question.
Hi, hello. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And really following up on that question, what is your relationship with the Muslim community?
Right.
At Telos, we have I mean, we don't work exclusively with a Muslim community in terms of trying to take them on in our programming to Israel and the Palestinian territories. We have had Muslims participate in our programming. We have had Muslims speak at our conferences, and a lot of our alumni from our trips have come back, and one of the ways they have wanted to live out what they learned was to engage in interfaith relationships. Often, particularly Christians come back, and because they are Christians in a dominant culture, they are often largely unaware of non-Christians around them, and they come, but their eyes are open to these realities when they visit the Holy Land, and they come back and they want to get to know there's a synagogue and a mosque right in the same neighborhood, and they don't know anybody there. And so some folks have gone the route of trying to figure that out, and we've helped facilitate some of those kinds of things. And again, we've worked with the Muslim community in the US to speak at our conference and so forth, that sort of thing. But we have not taken Muslim delegations. Well, actually we did once. We had an unusual delegation. It was a interfaith Jewish, Christian, and Muslim delegation that we took on a really fascinating trip, one of our trips a number of years ago.
Thank you.
Basu, what's the question?
I have a direct question concerning Islam.
Carl, there are so many questions, and you spoke a little bit already. I'd like to give other people a chance.
Okay.
I'd actually like to pass my turn on to my colleague Linford, who's on this call and has to go soon. And maybe I could switch places with him. Is that okay?
Okay.
We're both divinity school students working on a project connected to this. And so I would love if he
Great.
Yeah, could go. Linford.
Oh, thank you, Baskia. And thank you, Hanan, and thank you so much, Pat, for your talk. My question you can see in the chat. Should I read it?
If you want.
Yeah, good. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, and I say, so both Baskia and I have attended this talk because we are doing a project on anti-Jewish and supersessionist and dispensationalist threads in evangelical communities. So I come from an evangelical background. I'm now an evangelical Episcopalian, and I would respond, if I had time, to the one person's question about why reclaim the term evangelical. And I think there's some really good reasons for doing that, rather than just let it go to certain political forces. But anyways, so Baskia is Orthodox Jewish, and so we're making this project. But I will ask my question. So I was raised evangelical and was taught a cocktail of all three reasons to support Israel that you listed. So the end times, the lucky rabbit's foot, which I think is a really great metaphor, and then affinity of values. And it's also interesting to note the ways in which Orthodox rabbis such as Shlomo Riskin have picked up on all 3 points and used this evangelical impulse for their own Zionist purposes. But my question is, what percentage of conservative American Christians would you say subscribe to each or any of these beliefs about support for Israel?
It's a great question. I actually don't know the numbers. And Lifeway does, which is a Baptist polling organization, does some polling on this. And so I would check out some of their surveys. You might get something from Pew as well, but I don't think they probably break it down into these kinds of details. My gut would be that of all white evangelicals, there would be a minority who would have an end times theology. There would be a majority, a clear majority, that would see the idea that blessing Israel is important to America's own blessing, and then there would be a lot of the affinities value, and some people would have, they would not want to just choose one. But I would say that often outside people think it's all about the end times. And so there's this pejorative way the end times theology crowd is always held up. It's like these people are, waiting for the end to come and death and destruction, that sort of thing. And I think that's actually a minority. I'm not saying the others aren't unhelpful, but I don't think that's the dominant view anymore. And if they have the view, they don't have a thought out view. It's just I call it dispensationalism light, where they may have some idea about, but they couldn't explain the theology to you at all, because it's just not being taught anywhere right now in a serious way. Where are you studying in divinity school?
So Baskia and I actually are both at Yale Divinity School. But yeah, I did grow up with this, like you say, dispensationalist light kind of view. But isn't the dispensationalism still the predominant view at Dallas Theological Seminary?
It is. Yeah, so the extent it's still taught with authority, it's at Dallas Theological Seminary, Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and Biola in Southern California. But even in those places, as I understand it, at least it's one option, but it's not taught as the only way to, it's not the only eschatological view they hold. I may be wrong on Dallas Theological Seminary. The others, I think, have broadened a bit. But outside those places, it's really not seriously taught. It's still taught within Southern Baptist churches a lot, though, and in certain Bible churches. There's a sort of a non-denominational denomination called the Bible Church Movement, and a lot of the Bible churches still teach this in some detail. So it's still out there. It's alive. It's just, it's very contained in a small universe.
Todd,
Thank you so much for that.
I've been told there's a question from someone who's identified as B on our screen. Would that person like to ask his question or her question? I guess not. Then we'll go to Nancy's question. Nancy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I had to. One, and being here in Dallas, you feel it very much, dispensational theology. And when I moved here, we were told, oh, I forgot, Bailey Smith, I think it was, who told us God doesn't hear Jewish prayers. It made me very uncomfortable. But the two questions I had was, one, being here, I always get the feeling that the Southern Baptist evangelicals who were Baptists were founded by separation of church and state. Where did it change that they no longer want to have separation of church and state and want to dominate the state? And also, I always had the feeling that the evangelicals don't accept Catholics as Christians, and many of those coming over the border, I would think, would be Catholic. You know? Yeah,
those are great. So I'm not expert on the history of the Southern Baptist denomination enough to say with 100% authority, but what my understanding would be, to answer your question, I mean, the Baptist faith is definitely born in the United States. The early Baptists who had immigrated from England were very much, they were not a part of an established church in England or in the colonies. And they argued for a full separation of church and state. And so Baptists were historically and through most of their history known as being very much on the side of separation of church and state. And that is their long history. I think that all changes in the 1970s and 80s. At the same time that the religious right is kind of forming, there is a transformation of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Baptist denomination in America. It's the largest Protestant denomination in America. And that transformation occurred when sort of those leaders of seminaries and Southern Baptist institutions who were seen as liberal or progressive were pushed out in favor of more conservatives. And part of what they brought with them into the seminaries and into the institutions of the Southern Baptist Convention was a real commitment to this kind of politics that we're talking about. So engaging the political culture. And it was almost like there was an amnesia about their separation of church and state roots. I do know folks in the Baptist world who have spent a lot of time trying to call Baptists back to a different position on church and state issues with very little impact. But there are those who remember and harken back to that. And there are other Baptist denominations that are much smaller than the Southern Baptists who do still hold to those views, like the American Baptists.
May I put in, please, in response to that? It's part of the answer to that. This is Victor. I put it in the chat. Catherine Stewart has written about that specifically in her book, which I have listed in the chat there, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And according to her, many businessmen were very unhappy with the civil rights movements. And a few of them realized that the power they got came from religion, from the religious leaders. So they realized if they want power, they have to co-opt religion. So they specifically began to look for issues in which way in which to get religion to back them. You can read about that in the book. I have it listed there in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I get in? I think I had a question there. I think theologically, one issue that's overlooked is many evangelicals flirt with dualism. They view the world as a battleground between God and Satan, and that everything has to be classified as one side or the other. I once heard a caller to an evangelical station describe Barack Obama as the candidate of Satan.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I don't know how to say any better than that. That's absolutely a problem. Dualism and this creation of such strong binaries, which is what's been so problematic about the engagement of politics, because part of what we're seeing play out in America right now in our own politics is not that, our adversaries, our political opponents are not just, misguided, but fellow citizens with the interest of the country in mind. They're evil and they have to be vanquished. And that's definitely a contribution that the religious right has at least made to our politics. And it's being mirrored a bit on the other side in some ways too. And so I think it's very problematic when we live in that kind of dualistic world of just such sharp binaries of good and evil. It's a big problem.
Thank you, Todd.
And then can I ask a question?
Next, the order I had that Rhoda should be up now to ask her question. Rhoda,
Hanan B came back. He missed you because he didn't.
Okay, so
because he didn't hear. He heard B, and his name is Bilal.
Yeah. So would he like to ask his question?
Bilal, open your mic.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bilal Arar from Palestinian, and I'm agnostic. So I'm not a religious person, but I would like to ask about the interference between religion and politics. I think that since the beginning of conflict, it was more easier to solve, since it was more about land and about rights. But today, I think with the interference between religion and politics, especially with Islam and Judaism and Christianity, we have a huge problem, which is the rise of religious racism, or let's say. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to note is that after the rise of the different religious trends, especially the Islamic Sahwa or the Islamic awakening, and the rise of religious Zionism, is that today we're seeing the rise of different kinds of racism, like anti-Semitism and racism against Muslims and racism against Christians, which makes things actually more complex, because today, rather than we have to get both Palestinians and Israelis to get into some kind of deal to split the land or to live together, we are facing a problem of people who are right now demonizing Jews as being cursed people, or demonizing Muslims or Christians. It's very hard to solve. I mean, sometimes when I talk with many people, Arabs and Muslims, I feel like the conflict today is no more about land or even about politics. It's more became about religion, and they have that kind of strong feeling that they are fighting against Jews and they are fighting against Christians. So today, even if we want to convince both Israelis and Palestinians to some kind of compromise, we have to work maybe another 50 years to change this concept between both sides and between people around the world.
No, it's an important observation. My entry into this work was through the U.S. State Department, where we saw it as a geopolitical issue. It's largely a dispute over territory, and the political arrangement is the way you sort of solve them. And that is largely what this is about in some ways, and yet there are religious communities who have deep and historic connections to sacred space that can't easily be solved as a geopolitical with a geopolitical solution of just drawing boundaries and so forth. And what you have to realize is that policymakers also have to realize that You can't ignore religious people. You can't allow this to become a religious conflict. If it becomes a religious conflict, then you are in in that place where Morris is talking about, where it's good versus evil, and there's no solution if it devolves into a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims, or Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But you have to be appropriately appreciative of the religious identities and connections that people have to the place. And then if you can do that and work with religious leaders to identify solutions as a part of your political process, then you have a much better shot at finding some kind of arrangement that works. And the failure of previous political negotiations was largely to assume that religion is always part of the problem, has to be left out, because if religion gets in, it's going to turn it into a religious war. And that's not, I mean, that's a danger, but that's not an inevitability. In fact, it's the opposite. You have to draw on people like Hanan and others who are trying to articulate a Judaism that also recognizes that there are others in the land who also have deep connections to the place. You've got to do that, and that's to me, that's the only way out. That it's insufficient to just deal with it at the religious level. You've also got to deal with the other, the sort of power dynamics, but you've got to do all of that. And my last point of how we engage Christians on this is that we ask them to we look to defeat the worst of their religion by drawing on the best of it. And there are plenty of tools and resources within Islam, Judaism, and Christianity that teach how to live together with neighbors, with people who are different, that with fairness toward strangers and immigrants, however you want to describe it. There's a lot that's in there about how we can do that if we're willing to actually, go to those folks, go to those sources, listen to those voices, and sort of help amplify them.
Wow.
Thank you. I just want to add.
You want to add something? Okay, Bilal, shortly.
Yeah, shortly. I just want to add that the problem is much greater than what we ever think. I think also with the rise of social media and with the rise of YouTube and Facebook, it's becoming more complex, because today many people can reach different kinds of religious preaching that contains a lot of religious racism, let's say, and it draws actually from the 80s. And today, I think a lot of people get easily radical, especially with the lack of solution. So, do you have any opinion or anything to help to curb this trend that is going on in over of the Middle East, not just in Palestine, Israel?
We all have a lot of work to do right now. I mean, all of our communities, and these problems are large and national and global, and yet we all have work to do, and it starts in our own communities. It starts at the communal level, and we all have to I think we all have to do things like we're talking about, building relationships across lines of difference, finding work we can do together, really trying to seek reconciliation, peace, and justice in places where there's conflict, but doing it even at the most local level possible to start is all of ours to do. I mean, the world is it seems in a precarious place right now. It feels very, I mean, people in the Middle East have lived with conflict for decades now, and it feels in the United States now, it feels almost unprecedented in my lifetime how divided we are, and how it feels dangerous to me. So we all have work to do.
Well, there's so much more to say. I actually taken upon myself this week to cut down these sessions from 90 minutes to 75 minutes, but we already went to almost 90 minutes at this point, and there's more than 32 questions remaining that we're not going to have a chance to deal with. So I apologize to all those who didn't get to speak. There's nothing we can do about it. I would like to ask Todd if he has any final words to sum up. You don't have to, but if you'd like to take another minute to give a broad picture, we'd be happy to hear.
I've said so much already, but I'm grateful for the time. I'm grateful that so many of you showed up today and were interested in this topic, and for the way you've engaged it, and for your thoughtful questions and responses. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. But I'm grateful for the work you do, Hanan, and at Roots, and I'm inspired by the fact that there are a lot of folks out there, as evidenced by this call and many other things that we're seeing right now. People are seeing that this is a time we all have to do something. We have to step into it. And it's if you're feeling anxious like I am, it's a great way to channel your anxiety into good work, and it's a great time to do that. So I'm grateful to all of you. If you do want to follow up with any other questions, I can.
And you send us your email address,
I'm going to put my email
so we can contact you directly.
Yeah, and put it in the chat here. It's todd@telosgroup.org. It's very simple. So if you want to follow up with anything by email, just please do.
Thank you.
And you can check out our organization, telosgroup.org, as well.
Everyone here, telosgroup.org is the website of Telos, and Todd is now giving us his email address in the chat. Todd, thank you very, very much. You see the response here. People are really, really interested. I would like to close with a few words. One is that I really suggest and request that those of you who are able to donate to Roots, we cannot continue these events without your help. Because our fundraising has been greatly curtailed because of the pandemic. We're down about $100,000 for our yearly budget in Roots. We're really at the edge. We request anyone who's able to donate, let's say a minimum donation of $15 for each Sunday event you participate in. If you're able to give more, we'd really appreciate it. You can donate on the website, which is friendsofroots.net. friendsofroots.net. Don't go to friendsofroots.org, rather friendsofroots.net. I would also like to mention that next week we are hosting the Palestinian co-founder and co-director of Roots, Khalid Abu Awad. He's going to be talking about the prophets in Islam, the Islamic, Judaic prophet. All of the Islamic prophets are also prophets in Jewish scripture, and we'll be talking about a comparison between the Islamic prophets and the Jewish prophets. Lastly, in the last 30 seconds, I'd like to say as we close, at one point, Todd mentioned to us the important words of Telos, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And Todd said that he doesn't know if there's organizations here in the land, Israeli and Palestinian organizations, that are able to adopt such an approach. Well, I'd like to say that at the end of almost every oral lecture I give, I end exactly with those words, and I think it's fitting to say them again. The only way to really do something positive is to be pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and thereby pro-peace. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
And amen to what you said, Rabbi Schlesinger.
Todd, I have regards to you from Marina.
Oh, wow.
She's a good friend of mine and colleague. She just wanted me to send to you.
That's terrific.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. I was there in Israel for 3 years, 97 to 2000, and I saw some things over there. You know, I definitely agree that for peace, you have to be for both sides, and that as Americans, since we're so closely allied, that that we need to set a good example so we're not exporting racism.